We phased out nuclear a couple of years ago. There is neither the political will nor apparently the economic or commercial viability for getting back to nuclear.
Today, I am pleased to have as my guest Karina Würtz, CEO of StifTtung Offshore Wind Foundation.
There are severe doubts in the German market that all these projects that have been auctioned over the last years under this negative auction bidding design would actually ever be built.
Welcome to another episode of Excellence in Global Offshore Wind, the ExGOW Podcast. I'm your host, Philip Bassil. Today, I am pleased to have as my guest Karina Würtz, CEO of StifTtung Offshore Wind Foundation. Germany is currently attempting one of the most aggressive energy scale-ups in modern history, moving from 9.7 gigawatts of operating offshore wind projects to 30 gigawatts by 2030. But beneath the surface, a debate is raging over the negative bidding auction design and supply chain survival. On this week's ExGOW Podcast, Karina helps us pull back the curtain on the dynamics of the current German energy market and the path ahead. Karina, welcome to ExGOW.
Thank you very much for the invite. Very pleased to be with you today, Philip.
I wanted to start by talking a bit about your background in the industry, Karina, to bridge the early years in the industry with your current leadership role and the transition from legal and a commercial expert at the global utility RWE to leading national policy foundation really gives you a 360-degree view of the sector. So you were at RWE during a pivotal time of German offshore wind. Tell us a bit about the projects you worked on and your role, specifically on a unique project back in 2015.
Before I joined the Offshore Wind Foundation in 2021, I've been working for RWE for 14 years. And yes, I joined offshore wind in 2010. Beforehand, I've been in for 3 years in conventional power generation. And moved to Hamburg and started this new offshore wind adventure, which it really was. At that time, everything was new and nothing was really tested. And there were so many things yet to be developed. And I started setting up interface functions within the offshore wind construction department, ranging from risk management to insurance to offshore project planning and scheduling services for our development and construction projects at the time. And we always constructed 2 projects at a time, one in Germany, one in UK. So I've been around in UK also quite a lot. And more or less we built 1.5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity during those years when I was still in the construction department. And then by the end of 2015 to 2016, I switched to operations and took over the management of the offshore wind project North Sea East, Nordsee Ost, which can be seen here in the back, actually. It's pretty unique with its Semyon 6M turbines plus a jacket foundation, which is a combination that was needed at that time. Today, no one would do such a combination anymore.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the listeners to the podcast are on Apple Podcast or Spotify, but the folks that join us on YouTube can see your background, and those were quite the seas. Can you tell us a bit about kind of the depth of the water there and the type of jackets you used?
We had roughly about 22 to 28 meters of depth. And we actually needed to use jacket foundations because the project that had originally been planned with Siemens 3.6 turbines, sort of the bread and butter machine of that time, it was then decided to switch to the Semyon 6M, which had a much larger diameter of the tower. And although there would have been foundation monopiles available to cover for that diameter. At that time, the industry didn't have a hammer to with such a large diameter to hammer in this monopile foundation. So we had to switch not only the turbine but also the foundation.
And how far from sea was this project from shore?
Well, it is. It was reached via the island of Heligoland, and that was approximately 1.5-hour drive with CTV from Heligoland.
This is interesting because, with your background in law and then operations, commercial, as you mentioned, you've really spent, 15 years in a highly technical part of the industry. How has this legal experience being in the room, full of engineers, helped you manage the complexity between permitting all the way to construction that often stalls offshore wind projects?
Well, first of all, I'm not a legal by academic nature. I'm an economist, but there were a lot of interfaces to all sorts of disciplines, and legal was certainly one of the most important. Everything starts with a good contract and ends with proper claim management. And so these kind of interfaces, particularly when you're managing a multi-contract construction project, and at that time we probably had a multi-contract project, these challenges were really impressive. Today, offshore wind projects are normally built with 3 to 5 EPCI contracts. It has evolved as sort of an industry learning curve that makes most sense, in particular when including offshore logistics. But at that time, that learning was still needed to be made, and it wasn't there. And also at that time, there was a significant lack of jackup barges. So RWE at that time decided to not only do the whole logistics themselves, but also to design and build 2 jackup vessels, basically from scratch.
And as you mentioned, in 2021, you decided to move from a private developer to the Offshore Wind Foundation. What was the primary motivation behind that shift? Was there something specific, systematic challenges or other issues that you felt could be solved better through this platform?
Well, I've always been interested in politics. I also have a politics degree. And I felt at that time, so I've done development, I've done construction, I've done operations. I could do something different. I could start with something completely different now from my angle, from my point of view. And that was a good choice, definitely.
Very interesting. I want to shift to the current evolution in the German market. Of course, there are many challenges and many opportunities. But in terms of just to give a bit more context, at the end of last year, December 2025, there was 1,680 offshore wind turbines with a total capacity of approximately 9.7 gigawatts in operations in Germany. During the last year, 2025, about 41 offshore wind turbines with a capacity of 518 megawatts were commissioned. In addition, there were further offshore wind turbines and foundations installed. In anticipation of the expansion in the coming years, there's been a significant increase in installed capacity expected by the end of the year. So currently, Germany has a target of a massive 30 gigawatts by 2030 and 70 gigawatts by 2045. Can you talk a bit about the lessons, from the early days as a first mover and the pains, the growing pains of the industry and where we are today just to give it context in terms of how did we get here first, and then we'll talk about the path moving forward.
Well, a decisive element of the first initial years of offshore wind in Germany has been the feed-in tariff system that gave stability and calculability to a very complex situation. And it took out the market volatility risk out of the calculation of the business cases. And that was hugely important. This system has then gradually been faded out, and we have moved to an auction design with negative bidding. And this lesson did not age well. This did not go down well. We can clearly say, particularly in today's circumstances, geopolitical circumstances in particular, with inflation, with galloping inflation, in particularly in steel, but also offshore logistics, that this model could not work out. Particularly at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we have seen significant increases in the electricity price, but also significant, or perhaps much more significant price increases for main components. And at that time, the first auction rounds with negative bidding were introduced in Germany in 2023. And at that time, we saw really, really substantial biddings for the single zones that were on offer. But there were actually few participants in the market that could actually understand where these high bidding values came from. And we at the foundation, we tried to calculate back what must have been factored in the business case assumptions at that time. And it must have been a combination of further and significantly rising electricity prices and a severe, very relevant reduction in capex, around 20%, 20 to 30 even in some cases. And the assumption of always rising electricity prices in a world of renewable energy transition is, from today's perspective, just fundamentally wrong. Because with every new unit of renewable capacity that you add to the system, the hours of low or potentially negative electricity prices per year rise. So that's just the way it works. And with renewables, with very, very low OPEX and marginal costs. So that was one point where that was one flaw. And the other one was that apparently it has been factored in that huge reductions in capex could be made either via pressure on the supply chain because of large market potential market volume that one entity had won in the auction, or via accepting competition from China. So Chinese components is the easiest way actually to reduce your capex by that amount. Now we see that all these assumptions, for one reason or another, do not hold up to reality. And these projects all face significant economic problems. And there are severe doubts in the German market that all these projects that have been auctioned over the last years under this negative auction bidding design would actually ever be built.
You touched on a lot of important points, actually, and I want to dig into each one of those. But maybe just to back up, why offshore wind and why in Germany? So if we talk about the energy mix in Germany, of course, the country was very dependent on importing gas from Russia. That's obviously changed. Here we are in 2026, and there are other geopolitical, issues happening globally where, as we speak, oil prices are close to $100 and have been higher recently. Can you talk a bit about kind of the energy mix in Germany and why offshore wind is something that makes sense in Germany?
Well, as you said, Germany is not a resource-rich country on its own, but it has some coastline and quite nice floor conditions for construction of offshore wind. A lot of engineers, and there was a political will actually to change something a lot of years ago. Today we see that the totality of renewable assets in the system make up to between 50 and 60% of the German electricity generation so far. So a very massive build out has already been taking place, but this is not all offshore. By far, it's not offshore. It's a lot of it is onshore, and lately also very much we have seen very substantial additions in solar, which is obviously due to the fact that solar module prices have declined so heavily due to the Chinese overproduction facilities. We still have some coal and lignite, hard coal and gas. We phased out nuclear a couple of years ago, and there is neither the political will nor apparently the economic or commercial viability for getting back to nuclear, which can be seen by looking at recent examples from other European countries constructing nuclear power stations at the moment. Hinkley Point C in the UK, for example, where the costs are just exploding. Construction times extend. And also during operation, these nuclear power stations have some heavy risks inherent to themselves. So particularly when you look at the French nuclear capacities that have issues during summer with their cooling water that is then fed into the rivers and heats up the rivers too much over some certain criteria at which the power stations have to be reduced in capacity. So no real will in Germany to be seen, apart from some minor voices, I would say, that still favor nukes over other options. We do have some lignite in German soil, but lignite is very carbon intense. It poses heavy conflicts with the people living around the areas where the lignite is being brought out of the earth. Sorry, I don't know how to say that in English properly. It's not green. It doesn't seem to have any particular future.
So maybe just to recap, so it sounds like you're saying that nuclear is highly unlikely in Germany, and there's no political will or appetite. Although we do see renewed push and conversations and some projects around new nuclear developments happening. Obviously we've seen that those projects typically take longer than a decade, and every project we've evaluated has been over budget. But there is some hope, I suppose, with the SMRs. But you're saying that Germany, highly unlikely, will see nuclear in the near future. If we shift to, I know you mentioned lignite, but I want to get your views on gas as well. Actually, we're seeing globally, renewed interest in building more gas. We've seen delays on getting turbines. Obviously, capex going up significantly, and so on. What's the view in Germany on new gas?
Well, as with the nuclear discussion, also in gas, German politics tend to turn to the utilities to hear their views. And as with nuclear, they say there's just no viable commercial economical option for nuclear for a nuclear future. For gas, the situation is perhaps a bit more differentiated, but still, the German, the Federal Ministry of Economics plans at least 10 gigawatts of newly installed gas-fired power stations, and the utilities that would run these power stations have already said that they would need very, very high subsidies for capex in order to run these projects properly, because they expect that the hours over the year that these gas-fired power stations would actually be needed, and in only those cases they could be competitive.
So up to 80% subsidies on the capex. So this is the request from some utilities, even though, of course, we'll need some base load to support all this renewable build out. And I suspect, and we're seeing a lot more energy storage come online as well. But so in 80% capex subsidy, that is, did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
So maybe shifting back to kind of the offshore wind and auction design and the things that you talked about, the negative bidding. Can you talk a bit about kind of the structure of the tender for offshore wind, the auctions in Germany?
Yes, basically, well, these tenders are not going to be used in the future. They have been halted now, and the Ministry of Economics is now very busy working on a new draft with a new auction design, which will hopefully include an element of CFDs. But so the past auction design that we have was completely without CFDs, completely based on PPA marketing and on negative bidding. So you had a couple of sort of entry criteria that had to be met. And then there was this, and when there were multiple bets for zero subsidies, then you enter that negative bidding phase, and then you basically ended up with partially very, very high bids for the ground, for the licenses.
This is a very timely episode. I think, only 8 or 9 weeks ago, you sounded the alarm along with some of the other industry organizations, BVE, BVO, VDMA, and VAB, on the current challenges facing the sector. Can you talk a bit more about that announcement, and have you seen any movement from policymakers and regulators since? And I will note that we did see the following day, after you sounded the alarm, Germany canceled its remaining 2026 offshore wind auctions. After, of course, the August 2025 failure of the negative bidding, as you mentioned.
Exactly. Yeah. So these auctions have been cancelled, and there was a request by the sector, because there's no point in running in front of the same wall a second time. the Ministry of Economics has shown some degree of openness for CFDs, but still, I think they are a bit reluctant to just base the design completely on CFDs. I think they might still want to try if they wouldn't get a bidder who would be willing to pay a premium for the license. But I would expect that if all the actors know that if they hold still in the first round, just waiting then for the CFD round to kick in, then they will probably all hold still. The points with regards to the concerns that we and the other associations that you just mentioned had with regards to the supply chain. At this point in time, we don't know to what extent this is going to be factored into the new design. We know from the UK and also from the Netherlands, for example, that there are, or in the case of the Netherlands, will be some elements to foster the local supply chain, and also to hinder bidders, developers, to not give them the incentive to just rely on Chinese components for their projects. So this is what's going to come for the Netherlands and has already become true for the UK. To what extent this is going to be factored in the German law, we actually don't know. There has always been a traditional reluctance in the Federal Ministry of Economics, which is probably very mercantilistic, and has always shown some reluctance in terms of protecting its own industries from even unfair international competition.
And of course, that begs the question. Obviously, the targets are very aggressive. We're, around 10 gigawatts of installed capacity in Germany. What happens? Of course, that 2030 target is, unlikely to be reached, highly unlikely. It'll be pushed out to 2035, I believe. I don't know if that's been confirmed formally, but what happens then? Because on one side, the government, we talked about nuclear and gas and the alternatives, and they're very limited. How do you get new generation in scale? You have limited land, of course. So how does Germany achieve its targets?
Well, for offshore wind, I think we must actually face the realities and see what is feasible in which time frame. And 30 gigawatts by 2030 are definitely not feasible. But this is something that the foundation has been saying since the beginning of these objectives. Just because we also lack ports, for example. We lack heavy load quaysides, vessels, experts, the technical experts. So there are so many pieces, so many elements in the puzzle that each one for its own would be enough to ensure that 30 gigawatts by 2030 are not reachable. All taken together, it's just completely unrealistic. The point is, what we also see now on a European level is that unrealistic offshore wind installation targets offer a massive entry path for Chinese competition, because Chinese companies enter the scene. They claim, "Oh, you cannot reach your targets without us because you do not have enough whatever components, vessels, what you name it." we help you. We come with our overcapacities and we help you out. And but this needs to be politically debated and decided if that is actually the route that we want to take down, or if we can do better in also protecting our industries that have developed over here. So I would say 30 gigawatts by 2030 are unrealistic. Also the midterm goals, and also the 70 gigawatts by 2045, I would probably make a big question mark to that, because for 70 gigawatts, we would to realize those, we would actually need more space. We would have to factor in massive wake effects with 70 gigawatts installed. It would be better at that point not to focus too much on an easy to remember installation target, but on megawatt hour target, for example, or terawatt hour target. That's not as nice to remember, but it would give the right incentive, because at the end of the day, offshore wind is important because to the German electricity mix, because it offers quite high full load hours in comparison to onshore wind and PV. But when we start to reduce this competitive advantage, particularly in comparison to onshore wind, when we end up at full load hours of below 3,000, for example, then the competitive advantage of offshore wind is completely gone for the electricity mix, and it just remains more costly because of all the steel.
Yeah. So Karina, I hear you. Definitely some major challenges. If we look at Germany, obviously highly industrialized, and the growth in electricity demand, electrification for traditional industries, whether it's steel or chemicals or other manufacturing, in addition to AI and data centers and all the growth and demand. If you were sitting with the minister or others in the policy departments of the government, what is it that industry would want to see in order to see more projects come online?
First of all, CFD. Then, the European Union has issued guidelines and legislation around what needs to be included in future auction rounds. And there are definitely elements to foster local supply chain via the Industrial Accelerator Act, for example. And there are elements that focus on security and cybersecurity. And all of that taken together will probably make up for an interesting mix of pre-qualification and qualitative criteria in the auction design. And this is normally something that developers don't like too much, particularly qualitative criteria, because they are different to factor, and legislators do not like them so much because actually you cannot just put figures next to each other and then decide what the best figure is. So it requires some more common sense, perhaps, but that also offers the potential for legal troubles later on. So, and we have seen that in the Netherlands, for example, that also with the best will and political action desire that they tried to shape into qualitative criteria, at the end of the day, they didn't work out in practice quite as well as they had hoped for. But this is also a lesson learned from auction design. We are at a learning curve, and there's not the one thing that's right and the others are all wrong. But we all have to accept legislative bodies as well as developers that we all are on a learning path with regards to the best auction design that fits the market and allows for commercial viability without compromising on local supply chains.
So, Karina, obviously there are some major challenges that Germany has to overcome, especially around auction design and some of the supply chain elements. But we've seen other markets go through this, especially recently. If we look at the UK, AR5, that round received 0 bids. At the time, they were expecting a strike price, below 50 pounds a megawatt hour. We've seen other markets like Denmark as well redesign and bounce back. How quickly did the UK bounce back, and what lessons can we learn from them? Because obviously the UK now has recently awarded 8.4 gigawatts of projects. We see projects under construction. Offshore wind is definitely moving and progressing very, very fast.
Yes, definitely. UK bounced back within an unbelievable speed of a couple of weeks that it took them to bring all the industry actors together, developers, operators, ministries, and the likes, and to fix the problem and to come out with a new auction scheme. And that was a huge success. And so, yes, definitely there is other countries went through the same, and they bounced back. In Germany, they told us that they would need 2 years for a reform. So that is probably something that we can work on, the speed of reaction.
Wow. In the UK, I think it was 2 weeks, like you mentioned, but so 2 years in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So definitely speed is an issue.
Speed is an issue, and perhaps also the approach to industry and politics collaboration. So there is probably a bit of a different approach that we perceive in the UK with regards to how to collaborate with the industry to find suitable results.
Can you talk a bit more about that? Like, is there something that in the UK they do that to collaborate better with industry? What lessons can Germany learn there?
Well, to my knowledge, they invited for a huge roundtable, and there during these discussions, the options were put on the table and evaluated, and then the ministry came. 2 weeks later, they came with a new proposal, and that was agreed. In Germany, the first offshore roundtable on federal level that we had after the failed auction in August last year was in, I think, late November, and that was not with a focus on reforming our Windseegesetz, so that legislative piece that regulates offshore wind and the auction design, but with a focus on how do we prepare for the North Sea Summit. And although the challenges have been clearly laid down by all the participants, and it is to all actors, it's clear what needs to be done. The ministry still has taken quite some more time in comparison to UK or Denmark as well, to come up with a reformed design. To be fair, UK didn't have to switch completely the design. So they have been in a CFD design, and they had to reevaluate the levels of strike prices and a couple of criteria for admission. In Denmark, however, they had to completely switch the design, and they did that within 8 months.
Within 8 months, yeah. And in Denmark, Denmark has done a great job as well in terms of reform. It's a little more complex, the structure they have there. But again, for the UK to just recently in AR7 award 8.4 8.4 gigawatts, which also included some floating projects as well to really stimulate that part of the industry. It sounds like they're serious about it. And we've recently as this week, we've seen France announce massive ambitions for offshore wind, over 10 gigawatts, and probably one of the largest auctions coming up. So how does Germany keep developers' attention on the market when you have such alternatives? And these are mature markets. Of course, we know the UK is the largest offshore wind market outside China, and Germany's number 2 currently. How does Germany keep the developers' attention?
Well, that's a very good question, Philip. And it has been raised a couple of times by developers that they would like to invest in Germany, but they don't necessarily have to. I think one of the most prominent figures said that out loud in a press conference was Markus Kreber, the CEO of RWE Holding. So there is clearly a risk to the attractiveness of the German market for the time being. However, if we get it right now, then we saw it in the UK, we see it in other markets, that developers are able to react quickly, adapt quickly to new regulation, and that a market then is able to bounce back also at virtually no speed.
And you mentioned, I want to touch on this. You mentioned obviously the Chinese supply chain and different suppliers. With the constraints in the industry, and obviously now we have a number of markets, really ramping up. We still have significant constraints in vessels, cable, manufacturing, of course, port infrastructure. But how do we attract new supply chain to a market that's in significant growth mode?
Well, first of all, we have the supply chain companies already here, homegrown, so to speak. But we need to put them to give them the ability, the capacity to enlarge their production facilities. And this needs to be done via a clear financing support framework, via governmental financing streams, not via subsidies, just via, for example, collaterals, bonds, guarantees, these kind of things. That has always been out. Perhaps you know the KfW, which is sort of the German Bank for Reconstruction, a very large governmental body that channels finance in market areas where it is needed and where apparently the private banking sector cannot keep up with the demand. And the KfW always had programs to finance offshore wind projects, but no programs to finance offshore wind supply chain. And that is just a huge lack. We have been issuing warnings about that now for years, and but we've been told that they are working on it. So let's see how it goes and when in particular.
Is there more that the supply chain participants, the companies, or the offshore wind developers can do to be heard by the policymakers?
Well, if we knew that, then we would probably already have been doing it. It has been difficult over the past 2 years to get politicians' attention. There have been multiple crises, the war in Ukraine, now the war in Iran, all sorts of things. We had the premature ending of the previous government, and now a new government which has just taken quite some time in order to really get into office and get started. And so these are all factors that may explain the German slowliness.
Slowness, that's a good way of putting it. It's do you think the current government understands the energy security implications and importance of bringing on new offshore wind generation?
Well, it seemed at the North Sea Summit in January that they completely understood it and supported it. However, what we've seen since then, in terms of concrete measures, was virtually nothing. So we've seen a lot of talk about new gas-fired power stations, and although knowing that now we've just exchanged one dependency for Russian gas with a new dependency on US LNG, and everyone understands that we need to be more diversified and best independent from international energy market fluctuations. But still, well, perhaps the people in chief at the moment are just, with their personal experience, not very near to renewables.
Very interesting. It'll be interesting to watch and see how things evolve, Karina. So maybe, obviously this has been a very insightful discussion, both in terms of the lessons we've learned from a mature market, which, we would consider Germany a mature market, but also the critical reforms required, to achieve the next phase of ambition, of expansion. As we close out this episode, what key messages would you want to give the younger generation that sees all this geopolitical uncertainty and the mixed messages around the need for renewables, especially around offshore wind in Europe and Germany? What kind of hope can you give to the new generation about this industry?
Well, the future full or near to full renewable electricity system will give us independence from international energy wars. It will make us much, much less dependent on autocratic political leaders and their willingness to use that leverage that they have upon us. And it is the only way how we can actually combat climate change. It offers a huge potential for our industries in terms of very, very interesting professional possibilities and options. And for a younger person, our foundation, we go into schools and explain pupils how interesting offshore wind is and how fascinating, and how many different jobs there are, and how good the payment is, because that's actually a factor as well, apart from things like morally induced, we need to combat climate change and stuff. It offers very, very well paid jobs. And that, in an era where we see whole markets being completely converted by AI, that is, I think, a very comforting perspective.
On that note, Karina, I want to thank you very much. It's been a true pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you very much, Philip.